supervisory trial attorney at the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And so one of the lawyers who works under my supervision litigated this case, actually not supervised by me, did most of it. And then I got more involved in it. I was involved at the beginning in identifying it as a case that we thought was interesting for litigation. And then I was away from it for a while with other responsibilities. I came back to it towards the end of the case when we moved it to settlement. We had a 3-day mediation with a mediator who came from New York. She's a retired federal magistrate from New York. And so we moved towards settlement in that process. We didn't get it finished those 3 days. And I was the lead negotiator in the negotiations that reached the settlement. So that was my role in the case. I've done employment law for 30 years. I'm a graduate of the DU Law School, but Professor Marsh was not one of my professors. But I remembered, one of the striking things that came to mind to me when I saw this case was I remembered my civil procedure professors. I had one that year and I had another one the other year, had written a book together. One male and one female, so I was shocked to see that they had in fact really been hired about the same time, but she was paid less than him, and that throughout their careers she was paid less than him. So it was a little astonishing to me to see that about the professors I had had in law school. So that's sort of my personal attachment to it. I've done employment and labor law for 30 years. I came to the commission in 1999. And so the commission is a federal agency charged with enforcing Title VII, which prohibits discrimination based on sex, race, color, religion. Also, we enforce the Equal Pay Act, which is the other statute that was at issue here. We also enforce the Age Discrimination Act and the Gender Non-Discrimination Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act, but those weren't at issue in the case. So you want me to talk about sort of the unusual provisions of the settlement?
Yeah, briefly if you could.
Yeah. So I'll tell you the things that are unique. Well, first of all, the EEOC does not settle anything confidentially. So that is unique, but it's unique because we're the EEOC. This case was not settled confidentially, but none of the cases we settle are confidential. We also typically settle with a consent decree, which lasts for a period of years and has basic provisions requiring the employer to do training. There's usually a injunctive language in there, reporting and monitoring for the usually 2 or 3 years that the decree is in effect, and the decree is enforced by the federal court. So what's different about this case, first of all, is it's a 6-year decree. It's much longer than what we usually get. It can be finished after 5 for what I call good behavior. They basically have to be certified by this independent consultant who's going to work with them that they have been in compliance for the prior 3 years. Then the decree can end a year early if they are in compliance the last 3 years in a row. Our cases settle for money, and they settle usually for a lot of money. I've settled cases bigger than this, but this is $2.66 million. Is it 7 or 8 women?
It's 7 who are still alive and 8 who are part of the group.
So there were 7 women who received payment out of that $2.66 million, which is, well, I thought it was 8, so I have an average of $330,000 per person. It means the average is higher because there were 7 instead of 8. That's unusual. That's a big per person settlement even for our cases. It is also unique in that all these women were still employed. So when we get $330,000 for somebody, it's usually because they've been fired. So it's really unique to get that kind of money for people who are still in their jobs. We got them salary increases. Besides the $2.66 million, which is compensating for lost earnings and emotional distress damages, they also all got raises in their salaries, very substantial raises. That's unusual. It's not as unusual in Equal Pay Act cases or wage discrimination cases, but we don't have that many wage discrimination cases. It's not because it's not prevalent, but they're hard to prove. Then there's a provision in the decree that requires disclosure of salaries annually. That's unusual. You don't see that you can look at all of our decrees, they're all public. And it's unusual to see a provision like that, but it requires the to set up, if I'm remembering correctly, it's a website that the professors of the law school can access the website and see what other professors are making at their level or lower. So this case was about full professors, and so they can see the salaries for the assistant professors and the associate professors. Now the associate professors can't see the full professor salary, so they can only see the salaries of people at their level or lower. Another really unique provision of this consent decree is that the university is required to hire a labor economist who will do a pay equity study annually. I've done this for 20 years at the EEOC. I've never negotiated a provision like that before. But we thought it was really important in this case because we're making efforts to try to make sure that the pay gap gets closed, because it's not completely closed, even with the raises that we got. And the way we thought that we need to monitor that is to have someone who knows what they're doing, like a labor economist, go in and look at the data, because you have to adjust for years of tenure, experience, and all kinds of, it's a whole regression analysis and the statistical thing that I know enough to be able to write a brief on it, but I can't do it. So we wanted to make sure we were hiring someone who can do it and knows how to do the analysis. And DU is going to have to pay that person to do an analysis every year. It also requires that the professors get advance notice at the beginning of the school year of what the criteria and methods are going to be applied in determining their merit increases. Now, over the years, the law school has had, it's been a very mushy means for measuring performance for the law professors. One of the more recent deans started putting some objectivity in it, started measuring by points and set some objective standards, but he would never set the standards until he was actually doing the evaluation, which was happening maybe in December of the year after the school year that he's evaluating. So the school year ended in June, he starts his evaluation September, October, November, and that's when he decides what the criteria are. So if he decides now, by the way, that we think a law review published at Yale Law Review is worth more than one published at the DU Law Review, you didn't know that last year when you were writing your article and trying to get it published. So now they have to tell them what the standards and criteria are, how they're going to do the calculation on the front end of the school year. So if you want to spend your time writing a textbook, which the dean didn't think was as valuable as a law review article, then you can make that choice. You do that knowing that the school doesn't value that as highly. Then they have to hire this independent consultant who has a huge role under this decree. That the independent consultant helps decide who the labor economist is, advises them on the criteria and methods for the evaluation process, reviews complaints about, we call it sex discrimination affecting compensation, gets a little broader than just pay discrimination. It's any kind of sex discrimination that affects compensation. So the independent consultant has to review any employee complaints about sex discrimination affecting compensation. That person will review the reports that DU submits that are required under the consent decree to evaluate whether they're in compliance and provide a report to us and to DU about whether the independent consultant believes they're in compliance, and provide them advice with respect to changing their EEO policies and the training that's required under the decree. And the other thing that is unique about this decree is they have this informational template. I think the one thing we convinced them of is that the employees didn't really know what the EEO policies were. They didn't know who to go to if they had a complaint of discrimination. They didn't know what the process was. The law student, when I went to law school there, it was over on the old Colorado Women's Council, Colorado Women's College campus over on Montview, and then they brought it over to the DU campus, but they haven't really integrated the law school into the university, even though it's there on the campus. So they applied all the DU policies to the law school, but they didn't, at least the information we had from the people participating in our lawsuit was that nobody knew what those policies were. They didn't know where to go, when they found out about this pay disparity, they went to the dean and nothing was done. So they did agree that they needed to do more of an informational campaign, and it's really, this really was their idea. They came to the table with this and we thought it was a terrific idea, which requires them to set up 2 completely new websites, one for DU and one for the law school, so that employees can go to the websites. I don't know if these are set up yet. Can go to the websites and get information about this
Rita,
from the websites.
let me go back to something you just mentioned. They went to the dean, and it stopped there. Did that potentially hurt DU's argument?
I think in the legal sense, yes. I mean, the other really important piece of this that flagged the case, the first time I saw it, I went, wow, is that we had a memo from the dean acknowledging that there was pay disparity between men's salaries and women's salaries at the law school, and noting that the recent pay increases had pretty much closed the gap for the assistant and associate professors, but also acknowledging, I was shocked, that it did not close the gap for the full professors. And then, I don't remember if this was in the memo or if it was in the evidence, that in fact, those pay increases that helped close the gap for the assistant and associate professors had actually widened the gap for full professors.
So that's an excellent point to segue to the second year law student, Ms. Middlebrooks. You obviously have a dog in this fight in that you are a law student and you are a woman. So tell us about how you felt when you found out about this, and tell us what you're learning from this experience.
Yeah, so like he was saying, I'm a second year law student at DU, and when I first found
Can you
out—
guys hear her, or do you want her to use the mic?
With the mic.
Okay, sorry, is that better? I can just talk louder. Okay.
Yeah,
I'll just talk louder.
Raise your hand if you don't hear her.
So,
The judge needs to hear you.
Yes.
So when I first heard about the case, I was obviously very shocked that a building full of law professionals would be paying women law professionals less. And it's like, I'm paying this institution that's disrespecting women. So that was very difficult for me. I had Professor Marsh and another plaintiff of the case, and they were 2 of my favorite teachers. And to just know that they were not getting paid the same amount as, you know, the other half of classes I was taking was really hard and upsetting. And so a lot of the students also felt similarly to me. And so there were petitions going on at the school about this, and those were not met with very positive responses. Basically saying that we don't understand, you know, the full breadth of this argument, and trying to dismiss the students' opinions about that, which then was like, wow, like you're not even going to take us seriously about this issue, or you have to take our teachers seriously about this issue. So it was very upsetting. It's just hard knowing you can go to a school that's supposed to be, you know, a social justice university or a public interest university, and then internally they're not, you know, honoring those pillars that they, you know, promote throughout the community. So that was very difficult, but in saying all of this, it was great having those women faculty members to show us, you know, how it's going to be a long fight, but it's worth fighting, and, you know, there is a way to remedy, you know, past injustices. So it was very encouraging learning from those female faculty members and seeing how they carry themselves through this while still, like you mentioned, still working for the institution that's paying them less. So it was a really interesting experience my first year.
Before we go on, I was remiss.
Hey, Jim, just a quick note, if I may.
Sure.
We didn't talk about the amount of money involved, but women professors were paid $19,781 a year less than their male colleagues. Cumulative. We're not talking $1,000. No, this is per year.
Oh, the average.
In October of 2013. We're not talking about $1,000 here and $1,000 there, but nearly $20,000 a year less than the person in the next.
And that's on average. There were some plaintiffs whose gap was significantly worse. I should have read the statement from DU earlier. DU couldn't send a representative because of scheduling conflicts. They did, however, suggest we read the statement that they issued when the settlement was released. So this can be attributed to Leah Cadu, who is the interim vice chancellor of marketing and communications. She says, last May, the University of Denver settled a legal matter filed by the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission regarding compensation practices at the Sturm College of Law. One of the university's cornerstone commitments is to ensure that our academic community compensates faculty and staff fairly, equitably, and based on merit. We were able to reach a settlement that will not affect scholarship, financial aid, or day-to-day operations of the university. DU undertook the settlement process with great seriousness, deliberation, and care for all involved, which by its nature took longer than we would have liked. While confident in our legal position, we were motivated by action by our strong desire to move forward together. We believe the settlement will allow us to focus collectively on a present and a future in which the law school and the DU community as a whole can unite under our common values of equity, integrity, and opportunity. We are going to go back to the part about the statement that said they thought they had a good legal position, a strong legal position.
Well,
I want to pick at that just a little.
well, speaking for the university, they denied that they did anything wrong.
That there was some
they
sort of
just,
systemic.
and their position is that their pay practices were not discriminatory, that there are other explanations for the disparity in pay. And that they settled the case in order to avoid further litigation costs, which are extensive. That we
Sure.
settled it fairly early. They had taken the depositions of all the women. We'd done some written discovery, but there was a lot of work yet to be done. It was going to be very expensive experts.
Right, and that's a common
Exactly.
refrain across
Yes.
tort law, right? I
Yes.
couldn't afford to continue this.
Yes.
100%. Okay, with that set up, you're the prime mover here.
Yeah, well, the comment for that, when they sent it out for our grads, most of them were just outraged, and they said, hey, come on, you're not paying $2.66 million because you're doing something wrong. And come in and then go forward, and I would love to see DU get leadership that would say, yep, we did something wrong, now we're gonna go ahead, we're gonna be leaders, we're gonna make sure everything is right, we're really gonna turn it around. I think that would help.
So,
But, yeah.
tell me, since you're the prime mover here, since you're one of the plaintiffs, maybe you could talk a little bit about how you found out about this, what explanation you were given, and maybe, because I'm thinking journalistically, every story has a beginning, right? Something happened in the midst of time, you know, after the two tiny amoeba, but before today, to create this problem. So,
But I love history, I can't go back that far.
so if you have any insight into how they got into this position, I'd love to hear it.
Well, I'm not sure how they got into the position they were in, but the way I found out about it, a colleague, Ann Scales, when the dean announced there was a little extra money for raises, she sent an email to the dean and CC'd everybody on the faculty and said, can you reassure us that women are getting paid the same as men? And we all expected him to say, yeah, of course, what do you think? And he didn't answer. And so she got a little more blatant with her emails at CCing us all, and he refused to answer. And then he said to her at one point, well, if any woman feels she's not being paid equally, she can come talk to me individually and we'll take it into consideration. And Ann fired back a lovely email and she said, it's not a consideration, it's the law. And so, just really nice. And then she died very suddenly, unexpectedly, about 3 days later, which was kind of scary. But I decided somebody ought to continue on with this. And so I followed up and decided I was a good one because I have deep roots in the community and I wasn't going to be looking for a new job and all that kind of stuff. And so I thought I would be a good one. Nobody else offered to join me. I didn't ask anybody else to join me because it's, you know, kind of dangerous to sue your employer. So then I went to the dean. I said to the dean that, you know, that I was going to follow up on this. And then he's a clever guy. And so in the middle of December, he sent out these long-winded, dull, awful memo that nobody would read. I mean, middle of December any place. And then at the very end of that, he said, oh, by the way, and then gave these numbers. I missed it. I think everybody else did. So I saw him in February, and I said, I still want those numbers. I still want that answer. And he said, oh, I gave them to you. And I said, well, give them to me again. And so he did. And then I went to meet with him, and I said, okay, I wanted to see his cards. I wanted to see, what his defense was and that type of thing. And at the end of that, and that's the first time I found out that I was the lowest paid full professor, and I was the one who'd been there the longest. And so I said, what are we gonna do about it? And he said, nothing. And I thought, that's what you think, kid. And so at that point, I decided to go ahead and litigate. And so I hired a former student named Clarke, and I said, would you file a claim with EEOC and try to let EEOC know that I'm not the only one, that this happened to all the women full professors. And so he did that, and he followed up and convinced the EEOC, yeah, that this was a big deal, that it was all women professors. I found it entertaining because when I started this, first of all, wonderful, and I thank you journalists because wonderful coverage. Hit the front page of the Denver Post, and it was on Channel 9 News, and Gloria Neal did on the Gloria Neal show. She did a long segment on that, so it was very nice, and I think it was partly people realized that a lot of people care about this, and so the response of the university was, well, now we think about it, Professor Marsh, and they named me, Professor Marsh has been substandard since day one in everything. And I thought, very interesting, because in 2010, they had given me the award for excellence in teaching. So in 2010, they thought I was really good. And then in 2013, when I said, hey, I want to be paid as much as a man, they said, well, now that we think about it, you've been substandard since day one.
By excellence, did they mean mediocre?
I was going to ask him about that. So it seemed to me, and I was very pleased because wonderful reaction from former students and lawyers in town, and a big petition and all kinds of stuff. So lots of support from the people that I really care about, which is students and lawyers. So very good response there.
Let me ask you something. In the discovery process, were you able to figure out how far back the disparity went? Was it was surely decades, right?
Yeah, it went a long way. Now with the rules of the Equal Pay Act, we can only go back for damages for a few years,
Right.
basically. So yeah, but the disparity was there. And Rita mentioned that her professors, who were Sheila Hyatt, Bob Hardaway, I believe, from the description, they had co-authored a book on civil procedure. When they came up for promotion, it turns out that book was enough writing for Bob to get the promotion, not enough writing for Sheila to get the promotion, which kind of freaked me out at the time. I mean, it's the same darn book, and they co-authored the thing.
And they were hired like the same year.
Yeah,
maybe a
right.
year
So
before.
they matched, but that was part of what was going on. It just wasn't quite enough for the woman who was the co-author, but it was enough for the man who was the co-author. So that had been going on. And then when I started at the Law Student, I got a nice email. Lots of people sent me emails. One was a retired professor, I think it was in the psychology department. He was doing a book about the history of DU, and he went back, Bucktail Boulevard? Well, at one point there was a Chancellor Bucktail, and during his time, the Board of Trustees passed a resolution that men could be paid $1,200 a year and women could be paid $700 a year. So when DU says we're going to stick by our traditional policies, that was in the minutes of the Board of Trustees.
Indentured servitude is a traditional. That's interesting. So, is it fair to say that it may have been ingrained in the institution's culture?
Yes.
Just like a tick, a habit?
Yeah, I think what they did to Bob Hardaway and Sheila Hyatt was just a pattern that they figured they could get away with it. And I never would have known it was happening, but for the fact that Ann Scales started looking into it. And I never would have guessed that the law school was blatantly violating the law like that. It's just surprising.
So was it a little tense in the teachers' lounge while this was going on?
Yeah, well, we don't really have a teacher's lounge. Yes, there was some tension in that I began to feel, and so it's been a long time, but I've kind of felt like poison because it was clear that the dean, that the salaries were not based on really objective factors. That if the dean liked you, you got a high salary. If the dean didn't like you, didn't get a high salary. So walking in from the parking lot, I would normally just start talking to whoever was walking in at the same time. After this started, I didn't, because I realized that somebody might not want to be seen talking to me, because that's going to hurt that person's raise, which is a totally subjective raise. And so, and people, some faculty members would come into my office and close the door and then say, yeah, they supported me. Or some staff members would, if we were the only two in the elevator, they would whisper and say, you know, go for it, we support you, and that type of thing. But it was all this really quiet stuff. And so I feeling like poison, I didn't want to go up and talk to somebody because I might get that person in trouble. So that was difficult. The very good part was the students and the graduates were supportive from day one. They were really supportive, and those are people I care about.
Has it gotten better now that, is this all behind you now?
I don't know,
Back in
because
the Christmas podcast?
when we, before we got the settlement, I was getting a little fed up with being at DU, and it had been enough years since I had a sabbatical, so I applied for a sabbatical for this semester. So as soon as the case was won, I took off for Vermont. So this is the first week I've been back at the law school. But,
Welcome home.
thank you. It's good to be there. Part of the poison stuff, there was one faculty member who would make a big deal if we were both heading to the elevator at the same time. He would make a big scene about turning around and walking away so he wouldn't have to ride the elevator with me at the same time. And I just thought it was entertaining. I just thought it was so.
So it turns out all of life really is high school. It never ends.
But I noticed at some point there was a letter of support from fellow faculty members, which included a number of the male faculty.
Yes, it was very good. It was 23 members of the faculty, many of whom did not yet have tenure, and that took a lot of guts on their part. So they sent a letter to the chancellor and said, look, every place we go, all the public, you know, the gatherings of law professors and stuff, people always say, what is happening at DU? And would you please put a stop to it? They said, we know these people. They are very good teachers. We work with them. They are all very good teachers. And so they sent, and which took a lot of guts to send that, because a number of, you know, some were tenured professors, but a number were not tenured professors. And so that took guts. And then I thought it was interesting because it took the chancellor more than a month to answer that letter from faculty members at the law school. And she couldn't answer because the provost was out of town. I suppose neither one of them ever used his email. It was kind of amazing. And I think that's something that we need to improve the culture of the university. You know, the chancellor's got to be able to talk to the faculty. And she's got to be able to respond to the law school faculty without having to think about it for a month to decide what she's going to say. So that was very important.
You know, you hit on the word culture. In my career, I'm a big believer in healthy corporate cultures. I happen to work in a company that I think has a great corporate culture, the Associated Press. And in fact, we went through this exact same set of facts in the 80s. And the AP I grew up in had lots of women managers. I have had as many female bosses as male bosses. And I can only tell you that from an AP standpoint, it worked. You know, we are a healthier company because of it. But to your point about culture, expand beyond the law school. Are you getting the sense that this was a problem in other departments? Did you push a domino down?
I hope so. Yeah.
Is there any evidence of it? Yeah.
Yes, and as far as it being a culture, I got emails from people, women faculty members from around the country would send me emails on my DU email, and I was warned at the very beginning that probably the law school was monitoring those emails, so I would say, give me a call at home. These things, so as not to get everybody in trouble. But so I was getting it from women professors around the country who were feeling this, and also women professors at DU who were experiencing the same thing. So yes, I think it is going on. I think they're still going back to Bucktail saying, well, we can pay women one salary and pay men another salary. I think this has had an impact, and a friend of a friend, so this is, you know, you journalists wouldn't rely on this type of thing. I don't have a second source or anything else, but a friend of a friend has a daughter who's teaching at DU, and I can't remember it, I wouldn't tell you if I could remember it, whether it's history or English. But there were two women professors there who discovered they were being paid less than a male professor who'd been hired more recently, you know, lesser credentials. And so they went to the chairman of that department and they said, we're not being paid as much as this man. And the chairman said, that's a mistake, I'll correct it right now, and he did. And so I think that is a domino effect, that's something that EEOC has already had an impact. That at least one person at the university is smart enough to say, I'm not gonna make 6 years of litigation out of this, because a number of people told me they stopped giving to the EU. And this was an excuse to stop giving, and they were just really annoyed. And some of our big donors said, I'm not having anything to do with the EU.
Interesting. Well, Bob suggested I have you folks ask each other questions.